Welcome to an Idiot Box, where we watch, rate, and rank all forms of media that can be seen on a screen. My name's Samantha, and today we're going to be covering the entirety of the Ghosts franchise, and even comparing which one is better, the UK version or the US version. And honestly, I really like both, so this was quite a difficult video to make, and it's the reason why I've taken so long on this video, as since you can see from the runtime, I put quite a lot of time and effort into this. But before we start, I do have some disclaimers for the video. Number one, I will try to keep each section completely spoiler-free, but a few might pop in, especially when it comes to sequel stories, and also just so I can give you a general idea about the plot. Number two, if you do enjoy this kind of content, please be sure to like and subscribe for more videos. I'm hoping to do one at least once a month, so fingers crossed that I'm able to keep up with that. And last but not least, I will mainly be ranking these based on my personal enjoyment. I know it's completely opinion-based, but this is my video. If you have a different opinion, do let me know down in the comments, and when it comes to which one you prefer between the British or American version, also please let me know that down in the comments as well. But with that out of the way, let's get straight into the video and compare and rank both the UK and US versions of Ghosts. The first series of Ghosts came about because, essentially, the Horrible History show ended, and a lot of the production team behind it wanted to do something new, whilst also doing something familiar. And when it comes to season 1 especially, you can kind of feel this in a way. I'm not going to get too much into it yet, but essentially, if you've ever watched Horrible Histories, this does feel like a slight more adult version of that classic British kids show. And for the most part, I think it works really well. And a lot of the cast from Horrible Histories, especially when it comes to the creative team, are present in this, so it makes it feel a lot more like a spiritual successor, but instead of it being based off true events, it's very fictionalised, but in a very good way. And there's a much stronger focus on comedy in this compared to Horrible Histories, which at times got a bit too juvenile and silly, whilst this one definitely aims for a bit more of a mature, but still family-friendly audience. So let's get straight into it with the first episode. Who Do You Think You Are and Guerrilla War are essentially the two-part intro to this show. Now, they are two separate episodes, but I've counted them as one since, honestly, if you tried to watch Guerrilla War without watching the first episode, you would be completely lost on what the hell is happening. And as far as a pilot goes for a brand new show, this little two-part does so well. It's very entertaining, it's very funny. I love all the jokes at the start when they're trying to find a flat. I love all the stuff with Fanny basically just falling out of the window every day. It's really good, it's really funny, and there's a lot of character introductions in this, with 10 main characters being introduced in this episode, and none of them really feel sidelined. It's a really good pilot episode, and I can see why it immediately got an audience. So, yeah, this story's great. It's an 8 out of 10. Happy Death Day is the first episode where we get to properly experience the life of the ghost, and since we follow Pat throughout pretty much the whole episode, that's a big positive for me. I love Pat, he's probably one of my favourite characters, and there is definitely a reason why they did not change him for the American adaptation. He's just so fun and so funny. I love the fact that they kind of celebrate it almost like a birthday, but very melancholy. It's very depressing as well as happy. They're not really sure what to do about the occasion. Do they celebrate it? Do they not? And a lot of the comedy in this one is also really good. My main issue, honestly, with this episode comes down to Thomas, who in the pilot starts to become a little bit obsessed with Alison, but he starts to kind of expand in this one. And I also think that they missed out on some character development when it comes to Pete's wife, and yeah, it's still good. I just wish she was a bit more, but still, it's a good episode, solid 7 out of 10. Up next is Free Pass, and this is one of the first times we get to see how the house itself that the main characters inherit starts to affect other things to do with it. So during this one, they're filming like a Regency drama all around Byron, who obviously is a very famous poet and, yeah, really weird dude. And it's really focused around both Thomas's hatred of Byron, which is quite funny throughout. But the main issue I honestly have with this one is this is only episode 4 of the show, and already we're starting to see some of the issues between like Mike and Allison, who are the two main human characters. There's a lot of weird little conflicts in it, with Mike being overly jealous and just a lot of really weird decisions throughout the episode. It's still very funny. I think this is probably one of the funniest episodes, but when it comes to character moments, they seem to almost try and force things that don't need to be there. So I'd say it's still decent, but it's a 6 out of 10. Up next is Moonstoner, and this is the first time that we start to meet the Ben Chedwick neighbours, who are some of the best, worst characters in the entire show. Especially Barkley, who is one of those characters who is so well written that you love to hate him. And any time that he appears in an episode, I'm already going to be invested, because I just hate him that much that it's just really fun to see what he's going to do this time to annoy me. All the stuff with the dinner party is also really good. I love basically Allison just having a mental breakdown from what everyone else perceives because of the ghosts continuously interrupting it. My honest main issue with this one is that Robin gets a main focus, but it makes him seem a lot dumber than he's perceived in the rest of the show. Like, Robin is a very intelligent character, but just sounds stupid, and this episode didn't really get that yet, so it does knock it down a bit, but overall it's still a good episode, 7 out of 10. And last but certainly not least for Series 1, we have Getting Out, which honestly is my favourite episode of this series. It's essentially a bit like a pseudo-finale to the show if it didn't get renewed for a second season, and they treat it very well like that. Pretty much every single character has some kind of moment in this episode which just shines. I love all the stuff to do with the girls trying to figure out how to get Allison money. It's really funny. All the stuff with like Fanny's ex-husband basically just pawning off some of her most famous and expensive jewels. That joke every time gets me, and I've seen the show about 4 times. Like, it's just really funny. This episode overall serves as a really good finale to the season and sets up a lot of character stuff that was kind of touched upon but not properly developed, and it does it so well. I also love the ending. It's a solid 9 out of 10. This episode's amazing. And that's Series 1. Honestly, quite a good start to a show. Probably one of the best intro seasons I've seen for any British comedy, with the only real exception being Derry Girls. I just think that, like, a lot of ideas were thrown around in this season, some of which did well, some of which didn't so much, but I just love how interested the creators seem to be. They want to try new things with every single episode. Nothing felt samey. It all felt like it was just trying to expand on what is possible with this show. And as you can see from my ratings, there's only one episode that dips below a 7 out of 10, and even that one, I wouldn't say is bad. It's quite good. It just has some of those season 1 growing pains that I don't particularly like. And yeah, season 1 is just a really good start. I honestly really enjoy it. I'm very glad that apparently a lot of other people did too, because it was one of BBC's biggest shows for a first season ever. And I can really see why. I really like this season, and when it comes to what's next, let's just say that the experimentation of season 1 both gets expanded upon and also drastically reduced in a weird way, but I'll get to that. Following on from the success of season 1, the BBC pretty quickly renewed it for a second season, and yeah, looking at some of the ratings compared to other British shows at the time, I can 100% see why. This show was pretty much a smash hit from the get-go for the BBC, and what worked even better with this season is that they started showing it before The Watershed, since honestly, they didn't need to do that for season 1. And just for people who don't know, The Watershed essentially in Britain means that anything adult-focused can't be shown before 9 a.m. And this show definitely never needed that. Even though season 1 has some kind of gory moments, it's more just like tiny bits of blood. It's not explicit, it's something kids can easily watch, and it's nothing worse than what Horrible Histories did, including with the language and stuff. It's definitely suitable for all families, so I can see why they made this change. And with that out of the way, let's get straight into season 2. The Grey Lady is one of those episodes which experiments heavily when it comes to the character relationships, and in my opinion, it goes about it in one of the worst ways for a season opener. Essentially, the whole episode focuses on the fact that Fanny can be seen through cameras and shows up as a stereotypical Grey Lady ghost. It's a very interesting concept, especially when a bunch of paranormal investigators start getting involved, and it adds a lot of hijinks and entertainment. My main issue honestly comes from the way the ghosts treat Alison throughout the entire episode. We see at the start how much Alison does for them and how much she cares for them, and she asks them for a relatively small thing that they do anyway, and they just flat out refuse, and I don't really understand why. It's never fully explained. I understand the whole thing of like they don't want to be like a service monkey, but it comes across as really rude in my opinion, especially for all that Alison does, and it puts a massive damper on the episode, so I honestly can't give it more than a 4 out of 10, it annoys me. Up next is About Last Night, and this is when we start to hit one of the issues that I'm going to be mentioning a lot throughout the British version of Ghosts, and that's the lack of consequences. As I mentioned in the previous episode, the ghosts really screw over Alison for no real reason, and they never get any consequences for this. This episode seems to start with that, with a basic repeat of the start of the first episode, but only Alison isn't there. And then it turns out that it's because she's hungover. But literally everything after that, when it comes to the comedy of this episode, especially the ending, is probably the funniest episode of the entire British show. I laugh so often throughout this episode. All the stuff with Mike stuff on the roof, despite the really bad CGI, really funny. I love all the stuff with Alison basically just having a mental breakdown throughout most of this episode whilst trying to clean. It is so funny, and like I said, that ending, dude. It'd probably be a 10 out of 10, but no consequence, I'd give it a 9. Reading Weddy is the 3rd episode of this season, and I am definitely going to mess this up when talking about it, because Reading Weddy is already, just from the title, one of the funniest but confusing titles in the entire show. It essentially focuses on the group trying to get the place ready for a possible wedding venue, and focuses heavily on that back garden, which is an absolute disaster. I love all the stuff during the cleaning up. I love how Kitty just keeps getting in the way throughout the whole episode. It's really funny. A lot of focus is put on the captain this time, who is one of the guests, and it's a really good episode for him and essentially confirms a season 1 fan theory that he was in the closet. And yeah, it's done really well. My main issue, honestly, is that this episode feels like it should have been him coming out to the group, but it just doesn't happen. It feels like it's built up throughout the episode and just dropped. I'd still like it, it's still good, it's still a 7 out of 10. Up next is the Thomas Thorne affair, and this episode is great, just straight off the bat. It's one of those stories where it's essentially every character tells the same story but differently from their own perspectives, with different opinions on what happened as well as different memories of what happened, and honestly, when it comes to Thomas just straight up lying about what happened, it's a really good way to centre a plot like this, especially with all the characters being there but not really knowing that they are all there. I love the way that the story unfolds throughout the whole thing. I love some of the comedy in this one, especially the different ways that we see Thomas's death. I just find that really funny. My main issue with this episode honestly just comes with, and this isn't really a negative, more of a compliment, but I just wish it was longer. I would have liked to have seen more characters' perspectives on it. I know, like, you couldn't, but I just wanted to see more things. This episode feels like it was a bit too short, but even so, it's a solid 8 out of 10, it's great. Bump in the Night is probably the most memorable episode of the entire British show, and I'm not saying that half-heartedly. Even if you look at stuff like the IMDb, it's one of the highest rated. When you look at general audience reviews of this episode and critical reviews, it's one of the highest rated. And yeah, I love this episode. Essentially, Alison, who's the only one who can communicate with the ghost, goes away. And Mike is stuck home alone with the ghost, who can't communicate with him as some burglars come in. So it's essentially just 30 minutes of hijinks of them trying to figure out how to talk to Mike. And when they eventually figure out a way to do it, they completely screw it up. The whole thing is absolutely hilarious. This entire episode had me laughing pretty much throughout the entire thing. I love the character interactions throughout this entire thing. I love the way that they all try to figure out what to do, and Alison's reaction when finding out is hilarious, and even Barnaby ends up helping. It's a solid 10 out of 10, best episode so far. Up next, we have Perfect Day, which is essentially the season finale, but also not, because Christmas specials. And yeah, it's a good episode. I enjoy this one a lot. It basically builds on the plots from the previous episodes of this season, focused mostly on the wedding issues, but there's a few other things that are brought back as well. And I think it does a really good job of it. Honestly, my only real issue with this one is how quickly Mike and Alison's relationship can fall apart. It's weird and feels very forced in the episode that Mike suddenly turns into like a whiny man baby. And yeah, I don't really get it, in all honesty. But even with that said, I think there's a lot of good comedy in this episode. I love the brides and the whole joke with Fanny not really agreeing with them, but coming around to it. I think it's a good way to expand her as a character from this very old-fashioned style to thinking a bit more modern. And yeah, overall, it's a good episode and a good finale. 7 out of 10. Now, the actual final episode of this season is the first Christmas special, which is why this video is coming out in December, because, you know, this show's as close as I can get to a Christmas TV show. And yeah, it's good. I love Mike's family, especially his sisters, who are just absolute sibling assholes, but in the best way, in my opinion. I think it's just really fun to see all the different kind of interactions that we can have with people who don't know the ghosts exist, and it adds a lot of drama at certain points, which can be kind of funny. Mike's parents are also really fun to watch, but honestly, my main issue with this episode is the ghosts don't really do much. Despite it all being about the ghosts not knowing anything, there's almost not really any effort put into their actual characters throughout the whole thing, and it's kind of a downer. Honestly, if you remove the ghosts, most of the jokes would still work, and yeah, it's still good, but not the best start to the Christmas specials. And that's Series 2. Honestly, it's kind of a mixed bag for me. I do prefer Series 1 overall, but I will state that, like, this episode feels like it experiments too much at times, but also not enough. The first episode of this season I do not like, as you can see by my ratings, but this season also has my highest rated episode so far for the entire show. So, like I said, it's very mixed. I like a lot of the experimentation of this season, but already there doesn't seem to be much when it comes to development of the characters, something which will become a much bigger issue down the line. I still like it, I still think it's a good season. I just wish that first episode didn't have the ghost behaving so, well, dickish to Alison, especially given how much she does for him. But still, it's a really good season. I really like this show, and the show was obviously still pretty well liked. The ratings didn't get as high as season 1 did, but it was definitely high enough for the BBC to quickly agree to do an additional season. So, let's get on to it. Up next, we have Series 3, and this season, in my opinion, just, you know, a quick spoiler for you, I think is when they really started to get into their groove. The show just felt a lot more alive throughout this season, and especially compared to Season 2, it's like they tried to look back on all the mistakes of Season 1 and 2 to fix this one, and it really pays off for me. I won't get into too many details yet because I haven't gone through the episodes, but just a heads up, this is most likely going to be my favourite season of the British version. There's just a lot more cool ideas in this one, and a lot of the characters who are sidelined throughout Series 1 and 2 get a much bigger job shining here, and I think it really benefits the show because of it. So let's just get straight into it with Series 3. First up is the Bone Plot. Now, throughout series 1 and 2, there's a character called Humphrey who was beheaded well before the show began, and they really don't do much with him. He has a couple of cool visual gags, but that's about it. This episode changes all of that. We find out all about Humphrey's backstory and how everyone else perceives him as like this cool, awesome, like badass for fighting against the monarchy back in the day. How he basically had like his own version of the gunpowder plot, but in reality, none of that is true. I love his relationship with Sophie, who was his wife, how they were essentially like child brides and groom. And it's kind of depressing, but I also love the relationship between the two, how they respect each other but just don't love each other. And all the stuff focused on Humphrey is really good. The main issue of this episode honestly just comes from some of the side plots not being very funny, but all the stuff with Humphrey is great, so it's an 8 out of 10. Up next is A Lot to Take In, which mostly focuses on Mike. Now, Mike is probably one of my favourite characters. I have to give massive kudos to his actor for basically pretending most of the other actors aren't in the room, since his character can't interact with them due to lots of weird, fun ghost stuff. And yeah, it's really good. All the stuff as well, setting up the half-sister plot for the rest of this season, also really good. I love how it ties into the first episode, as that one had a subplot all about essentially Alison trying to advertise for B&B badly. And yeah, it's a really, really solid episode with all that. The main issue honestly just comes with the ending of this episode. So throughout it, Mike's working for a telemarketing company who's kind of scammy, and he just starts talking to this woman, and she gives him like this really cool life story. And at the end of it, he quits, which definitely, yeah, fair enough. But then she just kind of hires him, and it's a little bit too clean and happy for me. But even so, it's a 7 out of 10. The Woodworm Men is probably the funniest episode of Series 3. It's not perfect, don't get me wrong, but the jokes in this one just land for me. I love all the stuff with Kitty accidentally watching A Nightmare on Elm Street, and all the jokes to do with the fact she should have watched Grease. So with Alison saying stuff like, oh, but he's the man of her dreams, and Kitty looking terrified and going, yes, he is. Not understanding that Alison's talking about in a cute romantic way, whilst Kitty is just terrified of Freddy. All of that is honestly perfect. I love all of it. I love all the stuff with Mary. Mary's one of my favourite characters. I know I've not mentioned her yet in the video, but she's just so funny. How everything's like a deadpan, terrified response. I love Mary. Honestly, my only issue with this episode is that Mike acts kind of like a dick throughout the most of it, and I don't really know why. But apart from that, this episode's really good. I love the ghost interaction with Alison. It's an 8 out of 10. I Love Lucy is the most disjointed episode of Series 1. There's about 4 different plots going on throughout the episode which have literally nothing to do with each other, and it's kind of an issue. One plot is basically a follow-up to the sister plot from the previous episodes. Another one is all about Mike's job continuing, which is its own plot. One of which is just all about Humphrey and Fanny just dating, but it's only Humphrey's body, which is funny, don't get me wrong, but it feels very shoehorned into this episode, and yeah, it's just kind of messy. A lot of the jokes are really funny in this one, and all 3 plots do well on their own, but when it comes to blending together, they do feel like 3 different episode ideas that just weren't big enough to carry a full episode. So they just kind of merged them all together into this weird little blob. I still like it, I still think it's funny, and it's a 7 out of 10. Something to Share is the first proper episode focused on my personal favourite character of Kitty. Kitty is completely ditzy and dumb and adorable, and I love her and would protect her with my life if she wasn't already dead. Now, basically, Kitty throughout the whole show up to this point has always spoken positively about her sister. She's mentioned her only a couple of times by this point, but you could always just kind of feel that something was a bit off. And this episode fully starts to explore this as a concept, and essentially focuses on all the stuff with Kitty and her sister, and how Kitty's sister was horrible to her. but she just can't process this and likes to look at everything through rose-tinted glasses. There's some really fun moments throughout this episode, and even the captain gets a little bit of character development by nearly coming out of the closet, but once again, they just don't acknowledge it, which is annoying. And yeah, it's a really good episode, solid 8 out of 10, it's great. Part of the Family is a good finale, especially when it comes to this show. A lot of the time when it comes to Ghosts, the episodes don't really blend together very well, and some things don't feel like a proper conclusion. This episode is the complete opposite. This is a series finale. Like, this could have been the final episode of the show, and I would have been okay with it. It's just that well done. Pretty much every character gets a moment to shine. All the stuff to do with the sister plotline throughout the season is tied up really nicely. All the stuff to do with the renovations, which started all the way back in Series 1, so they could open the B&B, that's tied up really nicely as well, especially when it comes to the advertising side, which had popped in and out throughout the episodes. And the ending of this episode is one of the most satisfying moments of the entire show. Essentially showing Alison that even though she doesn't have any biological family anymore, she has her own little weird ghost family, and it's adorable. I really like this episode, and it's a solid 9 out of 10. It's amazing. But the show didn't end, and we got another Christmas special, which honestly is not the best. Now, I do like a lot of aspects of this Christmas special. I love the way how it looks at stuff that's not really talked about during Christmas, like the homeless crisis, and the fact that these people are just kind of ignored, especially when it comes to Christmas, because everything's meant to be happy and cheery, so we don't want to acknowledge the bad things. And it does a really good job of that. I really like all the stuff with Kitty thinking the guy is Santa, and all the little clues that he might actually be Santa, which is just kind of weird but funny to me. I also just really like the relationships between the characters, but the main issue I have, honestly, is just how out of character both Mike and Alison are with this guy, how rude and kind of snarky they are, despite not being that usually, and the fact that he does kind of take the piss a good few times about their hospitality. It's still good, but I'd say it's actually a 6 out of 10. And that's Series 3 of Ghosts. As you can probably tell from the fact I gushed about basically every single episode, this is my favourite series so far. Every single story, even the ones that aren't my favourites, like the Christmas special He Came, it's still fun. And as you can see from my actual ratings, nothing drops below a 6 again, so we're back on that solid foundation that Series 1 set. And yeah, this is probably my favourite series. I just really enjoy it. There's not a single episode that if it was on TV, I'd think about maybe skipping. I'd probably not watch the Christmas special again if, like, someone put a gun to my head, but I also don't mind it. I think it's cute and it brings light to a very important issue which isn't talked about enough. Even though nothing hits a 10 out of 10, the fact that the quality stays pretty high throughout is really indicative of how good this series can be. And yeah, just a few minor tweaks, and I think this episode and entire season could have probably hit like an 8 out of 10 overall. I still think there's room for improvement, but as far as this show goes, this is the best so far. And yeah, I really enjoy it. It's just a good series and would highly recommend people watch it. But obviously, the show got renewed for a 4th series, despite my hopes that the ending of Series 3 could have been the last episode, because it was just that good as a finale. So let's get on to Series 4. After another successful series, the BBC went, yeah, we're going to renew Ghosts again. And we got 7 more episodes, including the Christmas special. And just off the bat, this season is not as strong as Series 3. It's still very good, I still really like it, but it's nowhere near as good as Series 3, just to put that out there. There was also some stuff happening behind the scenes when it comes to some of the cast needing to move on to other projects, so there's a very shocking departure partway through this series, which I can't talk about without spoiling. So if you want to just skip to Series 5 and hear me talk about that instead, I completely understand. But there will be spoilers for partway through this season otherwise, so if you're okay with that, just stick with. And with that out of the way, let's get straight into Series 4. Happy Holiday is the start of the B&B arc of the show, something which was set up all the way in Series 1 and honestly took maybe a little bit too long to actually get to. The main difference being that it's not a proper B&B yet, it's essentially just the gatehouse at the start of the property has been renovated, whilst the rest of the house still looks pretty much the same as it did in Series 1. That itself kind of annoyed me, as I felt like at the end of Series 3 they were starting to big up the fact that the house was getting fully renovated, they had the money to do it, and then just kind of drop it in this episode and just do a gatehouse instead. Even so, I love all the stuff with the couple and how the characters try to kind of force them together to give them a good review. It's really, really funny. I love all the stuff with Robin and the news and all that stuff. And yeah, the ending for Robin's little story in this, really funny, especially how all the other characters react. And overall, I'd say it's a good episode. I just wish that they'd actually opened the proper B&B. 7 out of 10. Speak As You Choose is another Mary episode, so you'd probably think that I'd really like it since she's one of my favourite characters, but honestly I don't too much. My main issue with this episode pretty much comes from the B-plot. All the stuff with Mary is brilliant. I love properly meeting Annie, who'd been mentioned a few times throughout the show, and even appeared in one of the episodes previously. But with this one, we really start to see what happened to Mary after her death, the fear and anxiety that she had being someone who was burnt at the stake, and how she interacted with the male characters especially. All that stuff is honestly amazing. My main issue is the B-plot with Mike's friends. It's just not very funny, it's not very entertaining, and it's kind of boring, up until the ending, which is probably one of the funniest parts of the entire episode, I will state. I just think that the human plot should have been cut and focused a lot more on Mary, but it's still decent, it's still a 6 out of 10. The Hardest Word is a weird episode. I think that's the best way to describe it. Basically, at some point before this episode began, shortly before, the Ghost and Alison had a big argument, and Alison tore them an absolute new one. And the entire episode has been trying to make up for it, which is really funny. I love how they basically rip off Band-Aid with them all singing individual parts of an apology song, which Thomas ruins by rapping about how much he loves them. All that's just really funny. I love all that stuff. My main issue is how much Mary is sidelined in this episode. The previous one seemed to big her up really big, and she wasn't involved in the actual argument, so I get why she wasn't involved in the apology, but she just doesn't feel like an entity in this episode, which, because of the next episode, feels like a massive downer. But even so, the ending part where Mary tears them all a new one, also hilarious, so it's a 7 out of 10. It's good. So when it comes to Gone Gone, I feel like I need to split it up into two halves. First of all, there's a birthday party as a B-plot, which is fine. It's not that funny. It's relatively okay when it comes to the jokes and the stuff that happens in it. But when it comes to the main A-plot, essentially in the first 3 minutes of the episode, Mary is quote-unquote sucked off, which is in itself one of the funniest jokes in both shows. And essentially it means that she's ascended, and the episode's main plot focuses on all the characters trying to process this. The birthday party does sort of come into play when it comes to distracting certain characters from the reality of it, but at other points it just doesn't feel very necessary. It's essentially an entire episode of them trying to grieve, and there's an amazing moment with Robin, who's been around for thousands upon thousands of years, where he basically explains that he's too old to care and grieve the way normal people do, but he still does care in his own way. It's beautiful, so it's an 8 out of 10, it's great. Poached Guess is a messy episode. I'm just going to get that straight off the bat. When it comes to the actual A-plot, with all the stuff with Barclay versus Alison, with Julian's help, who I haven't mentioned much, but he's essentially a Tory politician who was killed in a sex scandal, which in itself is super funny in my opinion. I absolutely love the A-plot. It is so petty in that British sense of humour way. It's something that the American show could never adapt properly, and honestly, it tries to in a later episode and doesn't do as well. It's just really fun. I really like the character interactions between Alison and Barnaby. The amount of spite throughout it is great. The main issue comes with the B plots when it comes to Mike just spending money on absolute crap because of one mixed review. And all the stuff with the ghost meeting a new ghost honestly just brings out the worst in all their character traits to the point where it just gets really annoying. Even so, I still think the episode's decent, so it's a 6 out of 10. Episode 6, with Not Again, is a very, very funny episode. Throughout the whole thing, Mike and Alison are basically just fighting over this horrific taxidermied bear. I love it because the bear is horrific. I also love all the stuff with Kitty trying to learn what negative positives mean. Like, that's just really funny to me how she's just not getting it at all. My main issue with this episode honestly just comes from the lack of acknowledgement of Mary. Now, in the previous 2 episodes, she wasn't really acknowledged despite her, death, and that's really annoying. But with this episode, especially when it comes to a lot of the character interactions and it being a series finale, it's something I think the series 3 finale would have tied in, but this one just doesn't acknowledge it, and it feels a little bit weird. But even so, it's a great finale. The final few moments are really funny, and yeah, it's a solid 8 out of 10. Really good. And last up, we have yet another Christmas special, but this one actually nails it. So, this entire episode has, once again, an A and B plot like most of the other episodes, with the B plot focusing on the fact that Alison and Mike are trying to go to Mike's family for Christmas, but there's been some kind of accident, so they just get stuck forever in what is essentially car purgatory, which, if anyone's been on the M1, will know happens at least once a week, and it's horrific. And when it comes to the main A plot, it's all about the ghost trying to throw a Christmas present for Alison. And because they're ghosts and can't interact with things, they do a pantomime, and it is so funny. See the ways characters just start arguing, the way that they just kind of snide to each other, and especially the actual final performance itself, all really fun, really enjoyable. This is the best Christmas special so far. It's an 8 out of 10. And that's Series 4. I'd definitely say it's a downgrade compared to Series 3, and honestly even from Series 1 and 2. I feel like they just kind of stopped experimenting with this season. The only real major shift is the departure of Mary, which does absolutely break my heart, but apart from that, it starts to feel a little bit samey. There's a lot of plots in this season which, even though they are unique, don't feel very interesting. It's like they're just kind of going through the motions by this point, and it really starts to drain at certain points, especially in the first half of the series. And even so, you can see by my actual ratings, when it gets to the second half, I think it starts to shine a lot better. If the whole series was like the second half, I'd probably like it a lot more, but there's definitely some issues that I have with them. There's 3 episodes I really enjoy from this one. They're just really fun, really silly, and even the episodes that aren't that great, I still find a lot of enjoyable factors in them. They'll normally have really good A plots, but very forgettable and boring B plots. Even so, good series of television, and once again, the British public agreed, because we got very quickly renewed with a 5th season, which sadly would be this show's finale. And I've got some opinions on Series 5. Despite Series 4 still getting pretty respectable ratings, it was decided to make Series 5 the final one. And yeah, this definitely feels like a final series of a show. There's a lot of ideas which feel kind of recycled. There's a lot of moments which don't really amount to much. And one of my main issues with the British version of the show is when it comes to the character development, and I think Series 5 falls flat, as I'll explain later. There's a lot of good things to love about Series 5, especially the first half of it, but there'll definitely be a lot more gripes I have with this series compared to the first 4, And yeah, let's just get straight into it. The first episode is Fools, and this episode is great, just straight off the bat. Essentially, at the start of the episode on April Fool's Day, all the ghosts pull a prank on Alison and hide from her, and she interprets this as the ghosts have disappeared and she can't see them anymore. And it completely breaks her, and it's a very sad and sweet moment when she thinks she can't see the ghosts anymore. And all of them look like deers in the headlights when she did not take it as a joke. So for the rest of the episode, she's essentially just getting back at them. One by one, we see all of their character flaws brought straight to the surface and how Alice exploits them. It's really fun. I really enjoy it. Humphrey gets so much to do, which I always appreciate. And yeah, my only real issue with this episode is I wish it was a little bit longer, as some moments felt very rushed. But even so, great episode, amazing start to the series, solid 9 out of 10. Next up, we have Home, and this episode exists. Honestly, I've watched through this show about 4 times, like every single episode about 4 times, and this one I always forget because it's just not memorable. I mentioned that during Series 4 it sometimes felt like they were going through the motions, and this episode is the epitome of that. We just found out Alice is pregnant during the previous episode, and this one kind of tries to expand on it, but does it in a completely half-assed way. I really hate all the stuff with Kitty in this episode, and since she's normally one of my favourite characters, that's a massive downer. She's just annoying throughout the whole thing, and even though she's dumb, she's not this dumb, and it really starts to drag. A lot of the stuff in this episode just isn't overly funny. There's definitely some really, really funny moments, do not get me wrong. Like, all the stuff with Fanny is hilarious, but overall it's a mixed bag, so 5 out of 10. Up next is Pineapple Day, and this episode is essentially a finale when it comes to Kitty's characterization, as well as Barclay's. And I think it does a really good job with both. There's a lot of really good characterization throughout both of these episodes. And yeah, it's, like I said, this is the final season. It's the last time we see Barclay. And we finally find out what actually happened to Kitty for her death. Since the rest of the characters have pretty obvious deaths when it comes to like bullet wounds and stuff like that, we never actually found out about Kitty's, and it's a really good exploration. My main issue with this episode is it's not funny. There's no jokes that I laughed at. There's a lot of sweet moments that I did enjoy and I really liked. But I don't remember laughing once throughout this entire episode, and since this show's meant to be a comedy, that's not really great. I still like it, I still think it's a good episode when it comes to character exploration, but that's about as much as I can say for it, so it's a 7 out of 10. Up next is En Francias, and yeah, this episode's good, just straight off the bat. I love all the stuff with Humphrey and Robin, which must have been so difficult for the actor, since both characters are played by the same guy, so kudos to him for making the characters feel completely unique throughout this episode, where they have the most interaction in the entire show. We essentially also get a send-off for both Humphrey and Robin in this episode, where it finishes off both their character journeys that started all the way back in episode 1, and it does it really damn well. I also find a lot of the stuff with the French visitors who are looking at possibly buying a large stretch of land really fun. Oh, that's really entertaining, especially Mike's weird hatred for this Frenchman because he just keeps translating everything. And yeah, I'd also hate this translator because he's just really annoying. The only real issue I have with this episode is the rest of the ghosts and the blankety blank and all the game shows. It's just not funny, but even so, it's a 7 out of 10. It's good. Carpe Diem is probably one of the best episodes of this entire series. It's very emotional. Essentially, the plot revolves around the fact that Robin thinks that one of them is going to get quote-unquote sucked off before the end of the episode. And it literally follows every single character of the Ghosts coming to terms with this being a possibility. We see how each of them would like to spend their final moments before moving on, and we even get to find out a lot more about the captain, including his name, which had never been revealed throughout the other 4 series. And he nearly comes out, but doesn't, which is kind of disappointing. But since this is a final season, I think this would have been a really, really good final episode for at least one of the Ghosts. I think it would have worked better if one of them did get sucked off at the end, which is my main issue with it, because there's a lot of finishing of character stories. But even so, it's great. I really do like this episode. It's an 8 out of 10. Last Resort is the sort of finale to the show, and I say sort of because throughout pretty much this entire episode, you can almost feel that this was meant to be the last episode. Now, I have absolutely no source to state that it was always planned to be the final episode before we were given a Christmas special, but it's how I feel. Pretty much every single character story, which started off in episode 1, including full-on plot points from episode 1, are brought back and resolved here. There's no real unanswered questions when it comes to this episode. Every single loose end that could have been tied up is tied up very neatly in a bow, and it is done so really damn well. And it pretty much feels like this is the end. There's nothing more we can really do. And then in the last 5 minutes, they decide to not move out of the house, and it just continues, and it feels very jarring. So it's still good, it's still a 7 out of 10, but yeah, weird. And last but certainly least, we have a Christmas gift, which for the first 25 minutes is a bog standard, kind of bland Christmas special. I honestly like all the stuff when it comes to Mike's mum. I think she's just a really fun character, and I'm glad we get to see her one last time. I love all the stuff to do with the ghost obsessed with the baby, and the mum finding out about the ghost, but Mike and Alison not really telling her. All that's really fun. But then the final 5 minutes of this episode pisses me off, because it essentially just regurgitates the ending of the previous episode, but makes it so that Mike and Alison do leave the property and do sell it off. It feels really forced and not really connected with the episode. The ghosts weren't even that annoying throughout this episode, so I don't get why them being annoying is cited as a reason for them to leave. It really annoys me, and I'd say it's one of the worst series finales when it comes to those final 5 minutes. But the rest of it was good, so 5 out of 10? And that's it for Series 5. Honestly, a massive mixed bag of a season. It has some of my favourite episodes like Fools and, of course, Carpe Diem. Both those are really good episodes, and as you can see from my actual ratings, they kind of stand out like a sore thumb compared to the others. There's some good episodes in this, don't get me wrong, but there's also one episode which I can barely remember apart from a couple of decent jokes. And there's the finale, which, like I said, is not a finale. It feels like they just had 5 minutes tacked on at the end of a normal Christmas special to end the show that do not at all clash with the rest of this episode, or even really this season. The only reason I've not rated it lower than a 5 is because I do like the actual Christmas special that the episode is meant to be. It's just those final 5 minutes. It completely ruins the entirety of this season, and it's really annoying to me. But yeah, that's my opinions on Series 5, so let's get into my full-on opinions of the actual British version of Ghosts before we start covering the American version. The UK version of Ghosts is really fun. I definitely have some issues with it, especially when it comes to character development never being fully followed through. Like, just as an example, there are many moments where Julian especially gets moments of character development to not be as much of a bastard, and then he just goes back to being a bastard in the next episode. It's kind of annoying after a while. It's one of the reasons why I don't think I enjoy Series 4 and 5 as much as the first 3. As the first 3 seasons, yeah, it's fine for him to not overly develop the characters, you know, there's only 6 episodes and then a special for seasons 2 and 3, so I get why it can take a bit longer. But by series 4 and 5, the fact that the characters still feel exactly the same as they did in season 1, that's a problem to me, and I think it's one of the things that bogs down the British version. It's almost like the creators were afraid to expand from their original concept. They wanted to keep everything the same, they wanted to keep everything just basically the old saying of, if it's not broke, don't fix it. But the problem is that doesn't overly work for a TV show with characters, and I don't think that's something that they ever understood until the last essentially ghost-centric episode with Carpe Diem, where it did feel like a massive shift had happened with the cast. I also think that when it comes to Ghosts, we have to look at it from a very British point of view. The show is very cynical, I'll just state that right off the bat. This show is kind of miserable, but in an amazing way that's funny. It's full of a lot of sarcasm, a lot of British humour, which I do love. I think British humour will always be better than American humour because we are just snarky arseholes, and that's most of the fun of being British. I also just really love the initial characters that are introduced. Each one feels completely distinct and unique, and even though Thomas is by far my least favourite character because he's just very annoying, he still has a lot of moments that make me chuckle, and that's what you need most of all from a comedy. The also concept of this, just brilliant. Just ghosts. I am shocked this had never been done before, and I'm shocked that it took this long. I don't understand why this wasn't done before. I just can't get that over that. It's such a simple concept that works perfectly and beautifully that, yeah, kudos to these guys for making it, because it needed to be made, is the best way to put it. I also really, really love Alison. She is my spirit animal. How much she just stops putting up with their shit at certain points, really good. Overall, this show is great. I have some issues with it that a lot of other people don't, but I'd still recommend people watch it. It's still really good, and if you like the American version, definitely check it out to see its origins. But now that I've mentioned it, let's have a look at the American version. Following on from the very successful first 2 series of the British version, PBS basically looked at the success and went, I'll take some of that. So it was very quickly agreed between them and the BBC that PBS would get their own version of Ghosts. Originally only scheduled for 13 episodes, it was very quickly updated to be 18 episodes, since the show, pretty much from the beginning, knew exactly what it wanted to do. And just gonna say this straight off the bat, the American version is one of the best adaptations I've seen of an American programme, which was adapted from a British one. The only other comedy show I can think that's done it this successfully is probably The Office, but obviously very quickly The Office started doing its own thing instead of adapting the British episodes, and this one doesn't really adapt any of the episodes, apart from the first 2 episodes. So let's get straight into them with season 1 of Ghosts. Both the pilot and Hello is a 2-part intro, and just like I did with the British version, I will be looking at these as one overarching story, because honestly, trying to watch Hello without watching the pilot would be very confusing, and these are a straight adaptation of the British version. There's a bunch of cuts that have happened due to the way that American programmes are made, only being about 20 to 22 minutes, compared to the British version, which is about 30. And honestly, I think they cut out some stuff which sucks. For example, in the original version, Fanny falls out of a window at least once per season. It's hilarious. But this version's version of her, called Hattie, doesn't really do any of that. And it's a shame, but I honestly quite like it anyway. It's a really good little intro. You can already feel the differences with a much more light-hearted tone for this version. And yeah, it's still great. It's still a solid 8 out of 10. Viking Funeral is the first new episode of Ghosts. And it's a completely original story, not connected to any previous ones. And yeah, it's pretty solid. I love getting to learn a lot more about the different ghosts in this one. Now, the only real comparison is Pat versus Pete, who are essentially the exact same character. And even though Thor has a lot of character traits that were seen in Robin, there's a ton of differences, and this episode highlights that. It essentially shows a lot more of the Viking aspects of Thor's character. We get to find out a lot more as well about Mark, who is like one of the best characters in the entire show, and I love this little contractor who is both a friend and a scammy asshole. And yeah, this episode's just really good. It solidifies the overarching cast and does a really good job with it, as well as setting up a ton of plot elements which happily in this version would be revisited. So it's an 8 out of 10. It's great. Dinner Party is a loose adaptation of the British episode where they meet the neighbours, this time with the Farnsbys. And yep, these characters are just as annoying and detestable as their British counterparts, but slightly less arrogant. These are essentially the kind of rich southerners that you'd expect as a kind of cliche, but dialed up to absolute 11. They are awful throughout the entire episode. The only real negatives that I can give it is that I think the ghosts are a bit too annoying in this episode, but it is very early on. They don't overly know the main characters of Sam and Jay, and the developing relationships haven't really happened yet, so I understand why. Even so, Farnsby, oh my god, I just want to punch him. Not as much as I want to punch his British counterpart with Barnaby, but it's pretty close, I can tell you that much. This episode's really fun, but I do prefer the way the British version handled it at some aspects. Even so, it's still good. It's a 7 out of 10. On to the 5th episode with Halloween, and this is when the differences between the British and American versions really starts to come into play. So in the British version, as well as the American version, some of the characters have what are called ghost powers. And in the British version, it'd normally be done for gags or jokes with the occasional plot integration, whilst in this one, it really starts to come to the forefront a lot more. And yeah, for setting everything on fire is hilarious. I love all the stuff with the kids. I love the costumes that Jay and Sam are wearing. It's really funny. I love the ghost reaction to Halloween as like a dirty word in the house, since it essentially mocks them. And yeah, this episode is incredible. Every joke lands for me. Every character interaction lands for me. This whole thing is genuinely one of my favourite episodes, and there's a reason that every single season has gotten a Halloween episode. It's a 10 out of 10. Pete's Wife is essentially the last time that the American version tries to adapt a previous episode, with this one being an adaptation of Happy Death Day, but it does it in a much more interesting way in my opinion. Whilst Happy Death Day focused a lot more on the comedy aspects of everything, this one focuses on the drama that I wish the British version did. In the original, there's a joke about Pat's wife having an affair, and it's never really acknowledged again. In this one, it becomes a huge plot point, and essentially the entire second half of the episode is focused on Pete coping with the fact his wife had an affair, and it is dark but kind of funny. I honestly really like where they go with it, with all the stuff about his book and his badges all playing into it. I really love all those aspects. My main issue, honestly, is just the first half of the episode is a little bit slow. It doesn't seem to really know what it wants to do with itself until the second half, so kind of trundles along. But even so, it's good. It's a 7 out of 10. Episode 7 is Flower's Article, and this is one of the weirdest episodes of Series 1 in all the best ways. So Flower is a character in this one who's original and not based off anyone from the British version. And she's essentially a hippie who died whilst really high, so she's still partly high because that's how she died. And she keeps telling everyone about the time that she robbed a bank. But when Sam wants to write an article about it, since she's a journalist, Flower doesn't want it to be published, but then keeps telling people that she robbed a bank. And there's a really good character piece in it, all focused around Flower's life before her death, all the stuff to do with the actual, agency that Sam works for the news agents. Really fun. I love all the stuff with Sasopis. he's one of the best characters in this as well, and yeah, this episode's just really fun. It does a lot more for character building, especially for Flower and Sass, and yeah, it's just great overall. Solid 8 out of 10. Up next is D&D, and this episode we finally get to learn a lot more about Jay as a character, since honestly by this point it's essentially just been the Sam show featuring Jay, and because of that, this episode is already going to be in my good books. It also starts one of the best bromances in TV history between Jay and Pete, and their friendship is one of my favourite things since they can't actually communicate. I love all those aspects. I love all the D&D aspects, and the introduction to the British ghosts is really fun and funny. My main issue of this episode honestly just kind of comes with the British ghosts. A lot of the conflicts and stuff just seems to come out of nowhere. It seems forced. I get why there would be conflict, you know, he did kill one of them, but even so, it just doesn't feel organic, and especially towards the end, how they use D&D to make up, it also seems a bit forced to the overarching plot. I still like it though, so it's a 7 out of 10. Alberta's Fan is one of the best episodes when it comes to Alberta's storyline. So Alberta's one of the ghosts that was introduced in the American version without a British counterpart, and my god do I love this woman. She's just so fun, a 1920s jazz singer who died mysteriously in the house, and her arc is basically trying to find out who murdered her. Now in this one we meet a guy called Todd, who is an obsessive creepy fan. He even has one of Alberta's toenails, like, just on him. That's so creepy. I love Alberta's reaction when she finds out, because first she's so happy to have a fan, and then she sees it and is like, my god, why, Todd? And I just love any moment with Alberta in this episode. This episode is so funny. I love the ending, how we start to get drip-fed what happened to Alberta. I also just kind of love a lot of the character interactions in this one. They're just really fun. Great episode. It's a solid 9 out of 10. Finally, we have reached episode 10 with Possession. Now, this episode is hilarious. Jay's actor is so good in this episode. It's stupid and cheesy and completely over the top with absolutely no focus on realism for the acting. But do you know what? I love that. Essentially in this episode, it starts to expand on the mythology brought forward by the British version and starts to show stuff like possession, thus the name of the episode. And yeah, Hattie just kind of possesses Jay by accident, and yeah, it's so funny. Seeing Jay's actor try to act like how Hetty does is brilliant. All the stuff like that is amazing. My genuine only problem with this episode is because of the 20-minute runtime, it feels a little bit rushed, especially towards the conclusion, and I wish it lasted longer. Gee, if only there was an episode in season 2 that did that. But with this one, it's a 9 out of 10. It's near perfect. Up next is Sam's mom, and this has another plot point I wish was touched on in the original British version. So in the original British version, like, the main character's parents are dead, and she can see ghosts, but she never thinks to, see if her parents are still around as ghosts, while Sam does it pretty much immediately, and I wish Alison did this in the original. And yeah, just for that alone, that gives it massive bonus points for me, because it's doing the stuff that I feel like the British version needed to do and didn't. I love all the interactions with Sam and her mum. They're really good, they're really entertaining, quite funny, but also very heartfelt. I love as well when Jay is sat with her, and the only way she can communicate is using her ghost power of shrimp breath. And that's both gross and funny to me. This episode is just so good. It's really heartfelt and started to show a lot more of the emotional side that the American version brings. So yeah, it's another amazing one. It's another 9 out of 10. Jay's sister is up next, and yeah, this is just another great episode in a row. It's not as good as the previous two, but obviously, with any show, there'll be some varies in quality, but the fact that it's hardly even that much of a downgrade compared to the previous two is really telling of the quality of this show. And I love Jay's sister. She's become very quickly one of my favourite characters. I love the fact they bring her back at least once per season, apart from season 3, but I'll get to that. And yeah, she's just such a fun character. I love all the stuff with Trevor in this, who is essentially the pantsless guy in this one as well. Trevor is such a fun character, being a kind of like 1990s to early 2000s Wall Street douche. And yeah, all that stuff is really good. I love all the stuff to do between Jay and Sam, as well as her sister. Like, it's just really good character moments. Solid 8 out of 10. It's great. Time for Hetty to finally take the spotlight with the Vol. Now, Hetty is a great character, but I don't think she'd been fully elaborated on. In the background of all the previous episodes, they'd started to introduce elements of her character growth, such as her getting more into feminism and into women's rights, and she's doing very well apart from her hatred of the Irish. And this episode starts to solidify her character development throughout the previous episodes, and essentially has her husband, who obviously died hundreds of years ago like she did, come back by being hidden in a vault this whole time that ghosts can't enter. And yeah, he's horrific. His ghost power is to make people horny to the point that they can't control themselves, which is hilarious since he was a serial cheater against her. And I honestly would have given it a 7 out of 10 because I think it was good. But Hetty's final moment with the go to hell scenes and the new term of going down on us for people who go to hell, amazing, honestly. So 8 out of 10, it's great. Time for a slight dip in quality, in my opinion, with Ghostwriter. Now, don't get me wrong, Sass is one of my favourite characters. He's a Native American guy who is over 500 years old due to being a ghost, and he's just there for the drama and tea. That is all Sass wants in his life. He just wants drama, tea, and a girl who is also a ghost who works where Sam works. And yeah, I love Sass, but this episode doesn't do him much justice, in all honesty. I think it's kind of a shame because this episode feels very slow, and having the entire episode being about Sam and Sass completely at odds just feels a little bit off. It's kind of a shame, and honestly, I don't really like the first 15 minutes of this episode that much. I think they're a bit bland and not awfully funny, but those final few minutes where Sass is finally able to become the storyteller that his dad was worried he wouldn't be able to become, brilliant. Solid 6 out of 10, it's decent. And now, continuing the character-centric episodes, we have Thorapy, which is focused around everyone's favourite Viking of Thor, and yeah, this one is so funny. The entire episode basically revolves around Thor having night terrors for over 1,000 years. It's something Sass has had to deal with for 500 of those years, and it's basically just Thor having to use Sam to go to therapy since they can't actually talk to a therapist. I love all those jokes. I love all the stuff to do with Thor murdering their best friend and the mystery surrounding it of why did they murder the best friend, who was the best friend, yada yada. It's really funny. It's just a really solid episode. Nothing special by any means, but just very, very fun. So, solid 8 out of 10. It's great. Speaking of character-centric episodes, it's now Trevor's turn, where we finally find out why he's not wearing any pants. Now, I will state the first half of this episode isn't that funny. I find it fine, nothing special. It's a perfectly serviceable episode, but nothing really that interesting, until Sass basically interrupts Trevor to tell the truth about how he lost his pants. Now, obviously I won't spoil it here, but there's a really good heartfelt moment which shows what kind of character Trevor actually is compared to how he pretends to be. It's really good for him, and I'm glad it's something that continues in the background for the rest of the show. Basically showing that, yeah, Trevor's an asshole, but he's a lovable asshole. He's not a bad person. He's just stuck with some bad people at times. And yeah, I think it's really good for his character, but overall the episode isn't that funny and can be a bit boring. But still, I have to give it a 7 out of 10. It's good. Time to introduce a new recurring ghost character, this time with the episode Attic Girl, where we meet essentially a slasher villain's victim who has become a ghost. And that is a concept I absolutely love. I think they do a ton right in this episode, especially when it comes to Pete, my favourite little boy. I adore Pete, he's just so adorable and I want to protect him with my life, even though he's dead. And yeah, all that stuff's great. My main issue, honestly, just comes down completely to the ghost girl. Stephanie is just one of the most vile characters in this episode. There is nothing redeemable about her, and I get that's the point, but at a certain point it just goes from funny, oh look at how nasty she is, to mean with the whole French thing. And yeah, I'm really glad that in later episodes they do tone her down from this mean girl persona, because in this one it just does not work for me. It's a 5 out of 10. Last up for Series 1 is Fans B and B, which, I don't care what anyone says, Pete is right, that is an amazing name for a B&B. Fans B&B, perfect. This episode is really fun. It feels a lot more like a series finale, similar to Series 3 of the British version, compared to the other series finales of the British version, which don't really feel that final, in all honesty. It ties up a lot of plot holes and loose ends that have been set up in the previous episodes, especially when it comes to the rivalry that was set up between the Fansbys and Sam and Jay. It does a really good job throughout the entire thing, showing just how arseholey these people can be. And like I said, it basically fixes a bunch of plots which weren't resolved. And the ending joke, really funny. I love all the stuff with Thor, finally tying up that little crumpet that was set up in the first 2 episodes. Yeah, it's a great finale. It's a solid 8 out of 10. And that's season 1 of Ghosts US. And yeah, it's solid. I honestly think that it's the best season of the show so far, British and American. And it's more impressive for the fact that it had 3 times the episode count of the British ones. And yeah, if you just look at my actual ratings for each episode, there's only one outlier, and that's Attic Girl, which I just do not enjoy very much. But within the first 5 episodes of the show, this already got a 10 out of 10. It took the British version like 11 episodes to get there, which is pretty impressive. I just think that the American one knew what to do with the characters a lot more than the British version did. I'm a big fan of character growth, and I don't think the British version did a good enough job of doing that. I think they selected these characters, and then that was the joke. That's who they are, there's no room for exploration. Whilst this one really wanted to change things up for each episode. And I didn't even mention him at all, and I'm just really, really sorry to my boy, but Isaac is essentially the captain from the British version, both in the closet gay guys who are from a military background, and Isaac comes out at the end of his season. And yes, this is what needed to happen. This is good. This is what we should have seen in the British version that never happened, because there's now so much more of Isaac's personality to explore. And yeah, this is just a solid season of television. Probably one of the best first seasons for a comedy show I've seen in a while. So yeah, really like it. And obviously people did as well, since it got very quickly renewed for a full 22 episode season 2. Following on from the success of season 1, which final episode nearly hit 9 million viewers, which is just insane for a show nowadays, the show was very quickly renewed for a second season of 22 episodes, and thank God it was, because just gonna get it right off the bat, I do have some minor issues with season 1 like I mentioned, and season 2 irons out basically every problem I had. Are there still some episodes which I don't particularly love? You bet there is, but I'll get to those, don't you worry. But overall, I will state that season 2 is somehow an improvement off an already improved product. So, I don't really want to waste too much time, so let's get straight into it. We start off this season with Spies, and it essentially revolves around Jay and Sam opening the B&B officially by the end of last season and trying to deal with the first proper guest, and how odd these guests seem to be. Not exactly rude, but not exactly pleasant. And essentially the ghosts try and help out by spying on the guests and relaying information, but nothing that Sam and Jay do can actually please these guests. It's a really fun concept for an episode, and I'm so glad that this show finally opens for B&B, as I'm not counting the guest house in the British version as a proper B&B. This episode is when they finally start that plot point. It only took 6 seasons for me to get to an actual B&B in this B&B show, and I'm so happy about it. It's a really fun episode, and honestly, it's very enjoyable. It's got some good comedy. It's an 8 out of 10. It's great. Up next is Alberta's podcast, and it starts the season arc this time to actually fully discover what happened to Alberta. Instead of it just being like little nuggets that we got in season 1, we start to get some proper development in this season for the mystery. And it even brings back Todd, which is always funny to me. Love Todd, one of my favourite characters, even though he is terrifying and disgusting and just really, really gross. And yeah, this episode is really fun for all that. I also love the subplot with Flower and Hetty becoming like really good friends, and the washing machine, and I won't state anything else. It's just a really fun episode. Not amazing or anything, but just really fun. It's another 8 out of 10. It's great. Jay's Friends is the 3rd episode of the season, and it's slightly weaker than the first 2, but honestly not by much. It essentially focuses on Jay accidentally befriending a cult, and obviously Flower, the hippie girl who was in multiple cults in the past, she's a big fan of it. The episode is quite funny. I love all the stuff with the cult. I just find them very amusing, especially Trevor's obsession with one of them because she's on. It's just a fine episode. There is nothing really special about it. Some of the jokes don't particularly land for me, but it's still very fun. It's a solid 7 out of 10. I honestly can't fault this episode that much, but I also don't have too much to say about it. Time for our second episode focused on Sass, and this one is definitely an improvement on season 1's episode about him. It all focuses around a tree that the neighbours of the main characters want to cut down, but for some reason Sass is really determined to keep this tree alive. There's a lot of really good interactions between these new neighbour characters who, sadly after the next episode, don't appear again. I really hope they do, because they're honestly quite fun characters, and a massive difference from the Farnsbys, which is a really good parallel. And yeah, Sass gets a lot to do in this episode. It's a much better episode to focus on with him. There's a lot more for him to do, there's a lot more interesting jokes that he makes, and overall it's quite fun. The only real issue that I honestly have with the episode is how arrogant Sam goes. I get that obviously she has a direct source when it comes to Villanelle, but she does come across as a bit too arrogant in this episode. Even so, I still like it. It's a 7 out of 10. Time for our annual Halloween episode with Halloween 2. And yeah, this episode's pretty good. This time they try to focus more on the actual holiday itself and the importance of it compared to season 1's Halloween episode, and they conduct a seance, which accidentally summons Hetty's arch enemy. And yeah, the character development between Hetty in this entire episode, really good. Her character from the first episode of the actual show compared to now, basically by the end of it becomes night and day. She does such an amazing journey. I love all the scenes with her and the maid. They're just really good. Hetty very quickly becomes one of my favourite characters because of this episode. I already really liked her, but this is one of the defining moments of her storyline, and it's done so perfectly. It's really funny. I love how the vault's brought back, and there's even some references to the British version when it comes to communicating with Jay. Solid 9 out of 10. It's amazing. Episode 6 is The Baby Bjorn, and this is another 4 episode. I'd say it's probably his weakest episode so far, but not bad by any means. It introduces Thor's son, who he left behind back before he died. And it turns out that his son actually travelled to try and find him, and then also died anyway, but this time over at the Farnsby residence before it was built. So there's really fun scenes of the fact that there is another house in between the main character's house and the Farnsby's house, so they have to kind of shout out the top window and still pretend that it's like a private conversation, which I just think is really funny. A lot of the character moments between Thor and his son are honestly really sweet. I love all the stuff to do with the fact that his son married a Dane who Thor hates. And yeah, all that stuff's really good. But the episode is pretty slow. We don't get to the proper resolution until like the final couple of minutes. And yeah, it's a bit rushed, but still, 7 out of 10. It's good. Up next is Dumb Deaths, where a lot of the characters in both the British and American versions have very dumb deaths, and this episode just kind of sums up Bravo TV in a nutshell. I mean, I remember watching like horrible histories with the song Dumb Ways to Die, and most of the characters in both versions, yeah, this is definitely that just in a nutshell. It's really fun, it's just really entertaining. I love the differences between Thor and Pete, basically trying to figure out if they should do Flower's story or if they should do Pete's story, and all the drama surrounding it, especially since they have now become friends with Pete's family. It's really fun, and the fact that like they bring back one of the actors from the British versions who, like, yeah, that's just fun. I love Thomas's actor, so the fact he pops in as this arrogant method actor is really fun. It's another good one, solid 8 out of 10. Time for the liquor license. Now, this episode is also just really fun, once again. It focuses a lot around, you know, the B&B needing a liquor license, thus the name of the episode, and how they've basically broken the law for, like, the past season, since they've been operating the B&B since episode 1, but still don't have a liquor license, but in that first episode we see them serving alcohol. I just kind of love that as a detail, because you can tell both characters just completely forgot, and were like, oh no. All the stuff to do with the vault and like the kind of hiding bootleg stuff, really fun. I love the fact that Sandra from Superstar, and that's basically what she's playing in this as well, but a bit more grumpy, pops in as the liquor licensee person. It's really fun, great episode, another solid 8 out of 10. Time for another Christmas episode, and see, this is like a Christmas episode of my show too. I promise it's Christmas themed. I know most of these episodes aren't, but I really don't care. Now, the Christmas spirit is basically what I wanted Possession from Series 1 to be. Just more of it. The entire, like, two-part is focused around, essentially, Jay's sister needing her new friend to be possessed by Trevor so her and Trevor can sleep together. Now, let's not even get into the conversation about consent with this, because it's very muddled. But this episode is so fun when everything obviously goes wrong. I just love the idea of the ghost being able to possess people anyway, so this being a two-part and us to get fully exploring it for an entire 20-minute episode with a 20-minute setup really works for me. This two-parter is one of the best episodes of the entire show, and it's a 10 out of 10. Time for the start of a loosely connected trilogy with The Perfect Assistant, where essentially Sam and Jay hire a guy called Freddie, who has a new assistant to help out with the B&B. Now, this episode is very fun. I love Freddie. I absolutely adore the fact that only a couple of episodes later, we have a character called Jessica introduced, who is also from Superstar. That just makes me very happy. I love Superstar, and I will eventually cover it one day. So the fact that Cheyenne's here, really fun. And I will just keep referring to her as Cheyenne throughout the rest of this video. Now, this episode is a big one for Sass as well. There's a lot of intrigue throughout the episode of what actually happened to Cheyenne, so it's just really fun. I love all the development that Sass gets. I love all the stuff with Sam and Jay basically adoring Freddie. It's a really fun episode. It's a solid 8 out of 10. It's great. Up next is the family business, and I apologise in advance if you can hear some purring or some meowing in the background. It looks like my channel mascot has decided that he wants cuddles whilst I'm recording, and you know what? He's as much part of his channel as me. So, Jasper, what do you think of the family business? He doesn't seem pleased, and to be honest, I disagree with him. I think the episode's good, but I've seen a lot of fans really mean to this episode, mostly because it's nowhere near as good as the 2 episodes surrounding it, and that's completely fine, and I do agree with that. But I do think there's some really good moments throughout it. I love all the stuff to do with Hetty basically trying to turn Sam into a meaner version of her, as how she was back in the day. I love all the stuff with Freddie basically having a mental breakdown. All the stuff with Sass and Cheyenne's still really good. It just feels very much like the second part of a little mini trilogy. Even so, I'd still give it a solid 7 out of 10. It's good. And finally, to wrap off this trilogy, we have Ghost Hunter, which is the end of the Freddie and Cheyenne storyline, and yeah, it's a good one to go out on. Essentially, Freddie starts becoming obsessed that the place is haunted, which, you know, it is, he's not wrong, and tries to get a ghost trap to trap the ghosts. They all kind of take the mick until 4 is sucked in, and the rest of the episode becomes an absolute hilarity. I love this episode, it's really fun, it's very cheesy, but there's some very sweet moments, especially when it comes to all the stuff to do with both Thor and Flower. Their relationship in this episode really starts to grow quite aggressively, and in a very good way in my opinion. It's just very enjoyable. I love the way that Freddie and Cheyenne go out. It just works out really well for both their characters. I do wish that there was a bit more development when it came to Freddie leaving, but even so, I still really like this episode, 8 out of 10. Time for another Trevor-centric episode, this time with Trevor's body. Now, this episode basically ties up a plot point from season 1, where Trevor's friends ditched his body in order to cover for themselves, and in this one, his body gets discovered in the lake, now a skeleton. And we basically meet Trevor's parents, who are some very fun one-off characters. He's kind of headstrong mum, who's very sweet, but you can tell that she's done with her dad, and Trevor's dad, who is just what would happen if Trevor was still alive for those past 30 years. And yeah, it's a really fun episode. There's some really good moments in it. I love all the stuff to do with Trevor basically trying to figure out who he is and what he wants to do. It's just a really fun episode. I honestly don't have much more to say. It's great. 8 out of 10. Time for a Valentine's Day episode, which definitely does not ruin the fact I'm trying to say this video is a Christmas video, and it is a date to remember. Now, this episode is kind of adorable. It continues the relationship between Thor and Flower that have been established basically since the start of the show at this point. And yeah, it's just really good. Essentially, they go on a date together, but by the end of it, Flower doesn't remember any of it due to her issues with drugs. And there's a lot of fallout because of this, where they basically redo the day and some stuff's revealed. It's really fun, it's really cool. I just think this episode's kind of adorable, to be honest. It's just really sweet. I love all the stuff with Isaac as well. That's also just really cute. And yeah, it's just fun. It's a really good episode, and it's amazing for character development. So I have to give it a 9 out of 10. Speaking of Isaac, the next episode is Isaac's book. Now, since the start of the show, all Isaac's wanted is a book written about him so he can finally beat Hamilton, who is his arch rival, even though Hamilton had literally no idea who he was. And this is kind of a culmination of that. The main issue I honestly have with this episode is all the stuff with Sam's former friend, I say in quotation marks, who is just one of the worst characters in the show. She's not entertaining in that bitchy kind of way. She's just very mean for no reason. And the episode honestly just kind of drops her about halfway through. and it feels very weird. There is some fun to be had in this episode. I think a good few jokes are really decent. I also really like the relationship between Sam and Isaac. I think their friendship is just really fun to watch. But overall, I'd say this is kind of a disappointing end to this story arc. But still, it's decent. 6 out of 10. It's sequel episode time, this time with Weekend from Hell, which is a sequel to the previous Elias episode from season 1. And yeah, this continues the fun between Hattie and Elias. It's just really good to see these two characters clash. I love how much vitriol that Hattie now has for him, basically realising what a horrific person he was and how much danger he constantly put her in with his arrogance. And let's be honest, massive amounts of affairs. I also love all the stuff to do with Pete in this episode. Poor Pete, my poor boy. You just feel the need to protect him. And yeah, the whole thing is really fun. I love how by the end, it's basically revealed that, yeah, Elias would rather go back to hell. Spoiler, but yeah, he'd rather go back to hell than spend any more time with these lot. And yeah, it's a really good episode, really fun. Solid 8 out of 10. Up next is Alberta's Descendant, and this is the last episode really focusing around Todd being as creepy as he is, because I get it, the joke's kind of played out by this point. And the episode is very fun. I love Alberta's actual descendant, basically a great niece, and she's a very good and interesting character. I also love just any scene with Alberta, so that's instantly a thumbs up. And overall, I'd say a lot of the jokes land. My main issue with this episode is it feels very much like a filler episode. With all the other Alberta episodes, there's massive focus placed on her murder and all the mystery around it. This one goes back to season 1's thing of drip-feeding information, compared to giving us a big revelation like all the previous ones of this season. And it's kind of a downgrade. It's probably the worst of all the Alberta podcast episodes, but it's still fun, so I give it a 7 out of 10. It's good. At number 19, which makes this the longest season so far, we have Ghost Father of the Bride. This one focusing a lot around Pete's daughter having her wedding and where to set it, etc. This episode is really good for Pete. Now, Pete is probably like in my top 3 characters for both shows, and I love him and he's adorable and stuff, but he rarely gets a chance to shine, especially in the first couple of seasons of the American version. But with this one, a lot of that comes to change. All the stuff to do with Pete's daughter is really sweet. I love the amount of emotional aspects that this episode has. It basically follows his kind of sadness following the fact that he can't be at some of his kids' biggest occasions, but on this one circumstance he might be able to change that. It really comes in handy. I think it does really well for him. I love a lot of the conflict in this episode as well, so overall, it's an 8 out of 10. It's great. Sadly, it's time for another Chainsaw Girl episode with Woodstone's hottest couple. Now, I will state that they do make her slightly less annoying in this episode. She's not as vindictive or bitchy, but she's still just as shit-stirry and nasty, which is an improvement, but not by much. And this episode basically just focuses on all the couples that have developed throughout the show, and her trying to destroy every single one of them. It's a good concept. I do really like all those aspects, and I love the fact that basically all the couples survive it, despite all the drama. The main issue I honestly have is I just don't like her as a character. And since the episode is basically focused solely around her and all of her shit stirring, and the fact that she gets rewarded at the end of the episode for all her shit stirring, it kinda sucks. I don't hate this episode, and I think it's much better than her last one, and it's got a lot of good jokes, so 6 out of 10. It's decent. Next up is Who Done It, where we finally, after 39 episodes, find out what happened to Alberta. And all I'll state is that the reveal is so well done. There's a ton of hints that are given throughout the show of what it could be, all pointing to different things, and the twist of this one, I did not see coming on my first viewing, because It's so subtle, but when you look back on it and you get all the little hints and the tips, you feel kind of dumb for not getting it, and that's the best way to do a whodunit. It's the reason why I love the Scream films as much as I do. It's the perfect way to do it, and this episode nails it perfectly, and it helps massively that this episode is ridiculously funny. Todd comes back, God bless Todd for the final time, and yeah, it's just a really good way to end it off. It's a solid 10 out of 10. I really can't fault it. Last up is The Air, and this is another really good season finale, something that the British show didn't really get. Everything throughout the entire season is fully brought into this one. A ton of little plot threads, and especially the cliffhanger of the previous episode, play a massive part in this. Every single character gets a time to shine, which is so impressive for a show that has 10 main characters. And yeah, it's just a really solid finale. Some of the jokes don't land for me in this one that much, and it feels a lot more like it's focused on the drama aspects, which, don't get me wrong, I do like, but I don't really remember laughing that much throughout this episode. It's still great though, do not get me wrong. It's exactly what I kind of want from these kind of season finales. Everything tied up, everything sorted, but still with those little drops left just for the next season. I really like this episode, it's a solid 8 out of 10, what a great ending. And that's it for season 2, and wow, what a season. Honestly, there is only one episode that I don't love, and I think that's really impressive. This is the most amount of episodes that any season of the show ever got, and yeah, I am shocked it stays at such a high level of quality. I mean, as you can see from my ratings here, there are only 2 episodes that drop to a 6 or below. And honestly, one of them I was close to giving a 5 to, but then I remember how much I hate the Chainsaw Girl in the previous season and decided to give this one just that little bit of an extra push. Even so, this season is so good, and the fact that it has more episodes than any other season, but it's my favourite season so far, really goes to show the quality of the writing this time around. Like, don't get me wrong, I love the British version, but this season especially seems to meticulously fix or continue plot threads that I think the British version could have done much better. Everything about it is just near perfect for me, and the fact that there's like 3 10 out of 10 episodes, one of which is a 2-parter, that just makes me very happy. This season is so much fun, and I can see very quickly why it was renewed for a 3rd season. Speaking of which, shortly after season 2, season 3 was very quickly put into production, but there was a few caveats this time. Number 1, it was originally meant to be a 22 episode season like season 2, but then we had the SAG-AFTRA strikes and all the stuff to do with the writers, so yeah, kinda got reduced, and by the end of it, it only ended up being 10 episodes, which is quite a drop in episode count, and a lot of fans, including myself, were quite worried that maybe this was like them trying to phase out the show, but thankfully, it was just because of the actors and writer strikes, and even so, I don't think it worked out in the long run for this season. Now, I won't get too much into it yet, but this season is definitely the weakest of the American one, because you can almost feel the restrictions that were put on it due to stuff like the strikes and the delayed production. But let's just get straight into it so I can explain with the actual episodes. First up is the owl. So at the end of the last season, an unknown character was quote-unquote sucked off, and in this one it's revealed, I say in quotations, to have been Flower. Now, this was mostly down to the actress getting pregnant, and obviously Gus can't appear pregnant, so she took a little bit of a hiatus off the show for basically the most of the season up until the end. And yeah, this episode's quite good. It feels very similar to the one from the British version, focused on Mary being sucked off with a lot of the grieving process, but I will state that this one goes for a much more silly, cartoony look compared to the British's much more sombre, realistic take. And I think it does work out for the most part. I love all the stuff with Thor and the Owl, but it never feels like it gets sincere enough for me, especially compared to the amazing way the British one does. It's still good, so it's still a 7 out of 10. Up next is Man of Your Dreams, which is another Sasopis episode, which always makes me happy because I absolutely love Sass. And this one finally shows his dream power. Now, I'll just state, all the stuff to do with Sass and his dream power is really good. Like, I love the way that they kind of use his Native American background and his storytelling background to explain his ghost power. It's a really cool way to do it and expands massively, in my opinion, on his character. My main issue, honestly, is how selfish a lot of the characters are in this episode. With Sass, it makes sense. He's there for the drama and tea, so, love him. But when it comes to Sam, it feels a little bit out of character. Now, Sam can be selfish at times, but to this level of manipulation and gaslighting, definitely not in her character. But even so, I like it. It's a 7 out of 10. Time for another episode with Jay's sister, so you already know that this is getting a minimum of a 7 out of 10, as she is generally one of my favourite characters. And yeah, He Sees Dead People is another good one. I really like the explanation and exploration between Jay's sister and her sort of boyfriend, who is her boyfriend by this point, but she's also definitely still fancies Trevor. And I also like the way that they acknowledge what happened in the previous special that they were both in, all around Christmas, and his death for a good few seconds. Yeah, it's a really good way to take it. I like how there's a lot of kind of manipulation and kind of cheekiness throughout the episode. The only real issue I have with this one is a lot of a subplot between Isaac and Hetty. It just seems a little bit odd, and it's quickly resolved, so it felt more like padding than anything. Even so, great episode, 8 out of 10. Time for the annual Halloween special, this time with Halloween free, but no season of the witch this time, just the guest who wouldn't leave. And yep, this is focused completely on Pete's horrific cheating ex-wife Carol. And oh my god, I've not mentioned Carol before, but she is one of the worst but funniest characters because she is just so arrogant and selfish, but in a way that's kind of charming, and I don't really know how to explain it. And the twist very early on in this episode had me howling with laughter, especially when it comes to the ironic levels of what happens. Like I said, I'm trying to keep it as vague as possible, but this is such a good Halloween episode. This is almost as good as the first one. Every joke lands. I love the fact that Jay and Sam's new friends think that they're like murderers and serial killers. It's so fun, so entertaining. It's a solid 10 out of 10. It's one of the best. Up next is The Silent Partner. Now, at the start of this season, we started looking into different aspects of Jay and the business, and to basically look at expanding it into a proper restaurant, so Jay can finally get his dream, just like Sam did with the B&B. Now, this episode is quite good. I love all the stuff with Mark. He's just such a fun little side character. My main issue, honestly, throughout this episode comes to Isaac, who is a relatively selfish but lovable character. But in this one, I feel like they just dial up his arrogance to 11. Like, I don't get why he wouldn't want to help out, and I don't get why he'd be so obsessed with so many gross old-timey stuff. He's seen the past 300 years. He's seen how the world's evolved. I don't get why he's acting like it's still the 1700s. It just seems a little bit out of place and a bit like they're reducing his character, but even so, it's still a fun episode, so 6 out of 10. Up next is Trevor's brother, and yeah, this episode is fine. Just straight off the bat, this feels very much like a filler episode. There are tons of moments where it looks like Trevor is going to be expanded upon as a character, but just isn't. A ton of the character development just goes to his brother, who's a one-off character, so I don't particularly care. And the development isn't even from this character. It's very forced from everyone else to make him develop. And the whole stuff with the loophole that they take advantage of with the points, it's also just really dumb to me. Like, Jay and Sam are not morons. They're kind of dumb at times, but not to this level. I will say that a lot of the comedy in this episode, especially from Trevor, is ridiculously funny. So overall, I'd say it's a massive mixed bag. I still, though, have to give it a 5 out of 10. It's just very messy. After quite a while, we finally have an expansion on the ghost mythology, which is some of the funnest parts of the American version of a show, trying to expand upon things with the poltergeist. This time we find out about poltergeists and how they kind of attach straight to a person instead of a property, and we meet Saul, who is probably one of my favourite one-off characters in the whole show. He's just really fun. I really like basically any scene between him and Alberta. Their relationship is adorable, but obviously very whirlwind romance, and was never going to work out in the long run. Even so, I think it works really well for this episode. It's just really charming and really entertaining, and I really like it. Until the final 5 minutes. And honestly, it almost feels like they need to do a factory reset with the Alberta thing, and all the stuff with the stripper just isn't very funny to me. Even so, it's good. It's a 7 out of 10. Next up is Holes Are Bad, where we finally get Flower brought back properly into the fold. Thankfully, it was only 7 episodes without her, but my god, by the end of it was I starting to miss her. It just feels like the character dynamics are slightly off without her, especially when it comes to Thor, who hasn't been given much to do this season apart from mope around about the fact that Flower's gone. And this one is so fun. I love the explanation of how Flower disappeared being the most Flower thing the show could have ever thought up. She chased a butterfly into a well, and then because she's a ghost, she can't get out. There's also a lot of setup in this episode for the season finale and season 4, and it does it so well and relatively subtly, in my opinion. I just really like this episode. It's really fun. I wouldn't say it's the funniest, it's more plot focused, but do you know what? That is not a negative. So it's a solid 8 out of 10. It's great. Up next is The Travelling Agent, and this is a Pete story, so you know I'm already going to love it just by default, and this one, thankfully, is also really well written. There's a massive expansion on Pete's character. We get to finally see his ghost power, something that his counterpart Pat never had in the British version, which automatically will just make me like it. I love this episode so much. It explores so much about Pete as a character, how much he missed out, essentially, on the world, and how docile he can be, not really trying anything, because it's what he's told it wouldn't work. I love everything to do with this episode. It is so good, especially that ending, which is really funny. But yeah, this episode is generally just amazing. There's so many good character interactions, so many good jokes. I really like it, but you can tell it's definitely more of a part 1-esque to a 2-part story, even though it's not. So it's a 9 out of 10. It's amazing. For our season finale, we have Isaac's wedding. Now, even though this season was much shorter than the first 2, it still feels like a proper season finale, just like those 2 did. Everything culminates and is fully explored in this episode. Like I said previously with the travelling agent thing, you could feel a lot of setup for it when it comes to Pete's powers, and this one explores it perfectly, in pretty much the perfect way. There is so much entertainment throughout this episode. I love all the stuff to do with like the wedding prep, all the stuff to do with the stripper who Isaac's basically become obsessed with is really funny to me. And yeah, I really like this episode until the final couple of minutes where it really doesn't feel like a season finale again. It feels like it's setting up the next episode, which is part of the problem with this season, with it being so short. It almost feels like they just cut the episode in half and then just made the next one part of season 4. I still like it, I still think it's a great ending, so 8 out of 10. And that's season 10. Sadly much shorter, but do you know what? Sometimes that's not always a negative. Now, as you can see from our ratings, I do think this is the weakest season of the US one. Definitely not in any circumstance the worst season of the entire franchise. But when it comes to the American version, I think season 2 was just that strong that anything which followed it would kind of pale in comparison. And with all the production issues behind the scene, to do with like stuff like the strikes and the delays, I understand why this season ended up the way it is. It's still pretty good. There's still a 10 out of 10 in there. And the lowest episode is a 5, which, like I said, is never a negative. A 5 as your worst episode is still quite impressive to me. And yeah, even though it's weakest season, it's still very good and beats quite a lot of the British ones, in my opinion. I just think this season does such a good job of exploring things left over from season 2. I love the way they explain Flower's story. It's just so funny to me. And all the stuff with Nigel and Isaac's wedding, I think works out pretty perfectly to the way the characters have been presented in the previous few seasons. And obviously audiences agreed with me because we got another season which started the same year because, delays, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, let's get on to the current season with season 4. Now, season 4 was very quickly put on, mostly due to the fact that season 3 was essentially cut in half. And yeah, if you like the first 3 seasons, this season will also be for you. There's a lot more action in this season than I was expecting. There's bring back 2-parters and stuff as well, which is really nice. Both the kind of specials you'd be expecting with the Christmas special and Halloween specials also come back. And introduces a brand new character with Patience. Now, she is terrifying. I won't get into too many details, but I think so far they've worked her sparingly, and that's the right decision. If she was like immediately main cast in every episode, she'd get tiresome really quickly. So let's just get straight into it with episode 1. The first episode of the season is titled Patience, focused on the character of Patience, who was loosely mentioned last season and part of the cliffhanger of season 3, all focused essentially on the fact there was another ghost back when Thor, Isaac and Sass were there, and they lost her whilst accidentally falling through the dirt. Yeah, I love Patience in this episode. She is terrifying. It's really cool to actually see like a ghost villain, something that neither show had done by this point. And Patience is also quite a tragic villain. You can tell she's not actually a bad person. It was mostly down to the way she was raised in the times that she was raised, as well as going completely insane whilst being stuck in the dirt for 100, 200, 300 years. It's very funny, very entertaining. I love her relationship with Nigel and Sash. I just think it's done really well. It's a solid 8 out of 10. It's great. For our second episode, we have Sam's dad. So unlike the British version, it has been confirmed from the start that only Sam's mum had passed away, and she didn't really have a good relationship with her dad, compared to Alison from the British version, whose both her parents were dead. And honestly, this episode does a pretty good job between their relationship. It's done really well. I love kind of seeing the way that they interact with each other, with Sam's dad kind of refusing but also acknowledging how much they screwed up as a dad. It's a very mixed bag with that in the best kind of way. My main issue, honestly, in this episode is Patience. Already, she's kind of starting to overstay her welcome a little bit. Her main joke of just saying her name over and over again, absolutely insane, is funny, but when it's used every couple of minutes, it can get a bit annoying. I still like this episode. I love Patience's power. It works really well. So overall, it's a 7 out of 10. It's good. Time for another Halloween episode, this time with Halloween for The Witch. They should have just called it Season of the Witch by this point. It's they're teasing us, it's mean. And this episode, honestly, is the weakest of the Halloween episodes. It's not bad by any means, but when you have the first 3 episodes to compare it to, it can get a little bit annoying. And Patience especially, by this point, has started to overstay her welcome. My main issue with this episode is that it's kind of a send-off for Patience, which works for the most part, but it's the way it goes about it. All the characters basically have to behave like absolute morons when it comes to a statue. Like, we've already seen Patience's ghost power. No one else has ever had two. Why would she have two? It just seems a little bit far-fetched, and I guessed exactly what was happening before the twist occurred, which is always a negative. But even so, this episode's still ridiculously funny. So, 8 out of 10. It's still great. We have another Trevor-centric episode, this time with the work retreat, focused heavily on the fact that Trevor was this kind of douchey stock bro, and sadly, douchey stock bros still exist to this day, and how he's gotten a work remote job where his nickname / fake name for his job is Michael Jackson, that's just genius. I love that. I think that's a really funny joke. And shows just kind of how old Trevor is, since, MJ has been dead for over, 10 years by this point. And, yeah, the episode is really funny. I love all the stuff with Jay basically getting fed information. I love all the stuff, especially towards the end, when basically Trevor is worried about his name ever being known, and everyone there knows Trevor. It's such a sweet moment, such a beautiful look at legacy itself after death. And yeah, this is probably the best Trevor episode, and it's a 9 out of 10. Next up is A Star Is Dead. This episode, just off the bat, really funny. I love all the stuff with Mark this entire time secretly being essentially a theatre kid. That's just really funny. It kind of works as well for his character always being a bit too over the top and sassy. I love all that. It's hilarious. Absolutely adore it. All the stuff with Sam as well, really good. I love that we get to find out more about her when she was younger, something which hasn't really been touched upon since season 1. But this season we've got it both with her dad and this episode, which is really good to me. This episode is really funny. I love all the stuff to do with Sam's audition. I love all the stuff to do with her and Alberta's relationship especially. It's done so damn well. The only real issue of this episode is it feels like it stops when it fully gets going. It needs to be 5 minutes longer. I get that it couldn't be, but even so, it's an 8 out of 10. This is great. Up next is The Primary Source, which I'm just going to say off the bat is probably the worst episode of the American show. It's the most filler episode I think the show's ever done. There's 5 different plot points in this episode, none of which relate to each other at all. Once again, it just feels like a bunch of different story ideas that they shoved together, since the main plot of the Isaac's book deal just isn't impactful enough. The episode also feels ridiculously rushed because of this. I feel like it needed to be so much longer because of the amount of plot points in it. The stuff with the snail is really funny. I'm just going to stay that off the bat. I love how Trevor pretends to hate it and then basically just falls in love with this snail as a pet. But all the stuff with actual Isaac's book, I don't find it very funny. I find it kind of bland. I feel like by this point the Isaac book has been played out. It's a season 1 plot point. It's time to end it. It's still got some good jokes. 5 out of 10. For our second to final story so far, we have Sad Farnsby. Now, this episode, just like pretty much every other episode, has an A and B plot, and that's where my issues come into play. I'm just going to state off the bat, all the stuff with Nigel and Isaac, I've gotten bored of by this point. They've basically been going back and forth throughout the entire season, and it's gotten a little bit draining. But everything when it comes to the Farnsby plot is hilarious. I love what turns out to be the start of that argument. I love all the stuff with just the bickering, with Farnsby jumping forwards and backwards, with being friends with Jay, depending essentially on what mood he's in. All of it's really funny. I love all that stuff. I just wish that the showrunners would move on from all the Nigel and Isaac stuff, because it really drags down this episode. I do like the dinosaur callbacks. It is quite funny. So overall, it's a 7 out of 10. It's good. Last but certainly not least, we have A Very Aaron Dacre Christmas. And this two-parter, I'm just going to state off the bat, is probably one of the best episodes of the entire franchise. It is so funny from start to finish. As you know, I love me a possession episode, and this doesn't just give us one possession, it gives us 2 basically right off the bat. I love the way it's done. I love how Nancy's involved, who's one of the gross, kind of disgusting basement ghosts. Her in Sam is so funny. I cannot tell even now if Sam's actress was just miming and it was Nancy's actress doing the voice, or if it was her. It's that good. And then to add Jay's family, who already don't like Sam, on top of this, and Jay's sister, who, as you know, I adore. This two-parter is just so good. All the stuff with Pete's power coming into play is also genius. This two-parter is an amazing way to end this season so far. And yeah, it's a 10 out of 10. And that's it so far for season 4. Now, apparently it's going to be a full 22 episodes, just like season 2 was, so we've got another 13 to go, which I'm very happy about. But so far, as many little issues that I had with this season, especially when it comes to the filler episode and Patience feeling a bit overused, as you can see from my actual ratings, this is the first season to hit an 8 out of 10. Now, I am pretty sure by the end of the full season coming out, that will change, but currently at this point in time, this is my favourite season of the entire franchise, just barely. This season just seems to try and fix meticulously everything wrong with season 3. It does have a couple of problems, like the Patience thing, like Isaac and Nigel's relationship feeling a bit too dragged out by this point, but overall, the quality of these episodes are really damn fun, and I can't wait to see what the rest of the season has in store for us. But so far, that's season 4. So let's talk about the actual US version of Ghosts in general. US Ghosts almost seems to be the opposite of what UK Ghosts tried to do with the same concept. Whilst UK Ghosts would have a lot more recurring jokes, bigger laugh out loud moments, but very little character development, this one seems to focus much more on quick-fire jokes, some of which land, some of which don't, and a lot more character development, which, in all honesty, was my biggest criticism of the British version. It felt like it always wanted to do more but was holding itself back on purpose, whilst the US one does not have that issue. If they want to explore a character and basically change them throughout the course of a season, they will do it. I mean, for example, if you look at Hetty, she is not the same character anymore that was introduced in the first 2 episodes, and that is really good. It shows how much she's grown. Obviously, it's still actually the same character, they still have a lot of the same traits. When it comes to, her bigotry, especially when it comes to her use of cocaine, she has died down quite a lot with those, even if she is still relatively obsessed with cocaine. And yeah, I think it just works really well how she's basically become a semi-radical feminist. I think that's just a hilarious way to take it. Compare that to the British version with Fanny, who is the exact same character in the final episode that she is in episode 1. It's night and day when it comes to the development of characters in the American version, and I think it works really well for it. Hopefully this show keeps going on because I really enjoy it. And yeah, it's just really fun. I think it beats the British version in quite a few ways. It does fall short of the big laugh out loud moments. For example, once again talking about Hetty/Fanny, in the British version, Fanny falls out of a window every day at 7 a.m, and I don't know why, but I find it absolutely hilarious. They kind of remove that joke here and seem to have much more of a focus on the short-term jokes, and especially have a bigger focus on the ghost powers. I do like how in the British version a lot of the ghosts don't have powers, which makes them feel kind of useless, but I also love the way that the American version, that one focuses a lot heavier on the powers. Each character has one to some degree, with the only real exception at the moment being Hay, but especially with this season, it feels like it's building up to something, and hopefully by the end of season 4, it will fully show the kind of powers that she actually has. And yeah, that's it for the American version, so I guess the only thing to do now is to compare the two. So with a full-blown comparison between the two shows, I'm just going to bring up my actual rankings for each season. As you can see here, there's a lot of disparity. I think a lot of the British humour works much better, but I also think that the Americans focus on plot and essentially actually developing the characters works massively to its favour. I mean, just look at the kind of disparities between the actual ratings per season, especially when it comes to season 5 of the British version. Now, I know we don't have a proper comparison for that one, since obviously the show's currently in the middle of its 4th season, but if we compare season 1 compared to series 1, you can see the kind of differences in the actual numbers involved. The original version of the British show has a 7.5 is what I gave it on average, whilst the American version, which has triple the amount of episodes, has a 7.72. That's impressive in my opinion. I know that all of this is my opinion. You might rate the British version as a 10 out of 10 for every episode, and you might rate the American version as a 2. But for me, this just works so much better in the American version. There's so much more character development. The quickfire jokes don't always work in the American version. I think quite a lot of the jokes aren't very funny and I just kind of ignore them, but it will still make me laugh, usually at least once per episode. Whilst with the British version's massive build-up of a joke, it feels like it's always trying to up itself, and if that joke doesn't land, then I just don't feel anything, and I can basically write off the whole episode. I think there's a lot when it comes to both shows being high quality, though. This franchise is very impressive. It's rare to have such controversial opinions about which is better. Usually it's very clear. Like, when it comes to The Office, I think a lot of people would argue that the American version is better, mostly for the fact it went on longer and had much better, characters. Whilst the British version only had the 2 seasons and then gave up. But if you focus on something like The In-Betweeners, that one is obviously given to the British version. The American version is one of the worst shows I think I've ever seen in my life, and I think a lot of the times Americans don't get what makes British shows work. A lot of it is the vulgar humour and the nastiness and the sarcasm. But with Ghosts and with The Office as well, both of these seem to keep some of those elements. Like Sass, for example, is an American character, him being Native American, but he feels like he'd fit in perfectly with the British cast due to the amount of kind of shit-stirring and sarcasm and not really giving a crap. That's much more British humour, and I think the American version does a really good job adapting it by basically adding this character who would fit in perfectly with the British version. There are some negatives I will state about the American version. I think some of the plot points, because the seasons are so long, can drag out. Examples include stuff like Flower's disappearance, even though I understand that was due to the actress. Isaac and Nigel's relationship by this point I am bored of 100%. I'm just sick of the two of them basically acting like children, and hopefully, judging by the last time that they spoke on screen, that is coming to an end. But when it comes to the British version, because the seasons are so short, it never feels like anything's being dragged out, apart from the overarching story of the B&B actually opening. Season arcs, such as The Sister, is done really well, and even though that's loosely adapted in the American version, they basically drop it within an episode, which does feel a bit weird. I do like the way that both shows counteract things, but if I show my actual rankings of the seasons against each other, yeah, the top 3 are all American. Now, I will say I am kind of harsh on season 3 of the American version, but I just think that series 3 and series 1 of the British version do a much better job at the comedy. It's still a really good show, and I would highly recommend anyone checks out both shows. It's so enjoyable, it's so funny. The massive ensemble of characters means that at least one of the characters you will connect with and enjoy. And yeah, that's it for Ghosts. A really good show, really enjoyable. I've really enjoyed making this video, despite the fact that by the end of this my throat is absolutely killing me. I've had to do a lot of re-recording as well, because, mental health absolutely sucks. So if you do enjoy this kind of content, please be sure to like and subscribe. It has taken me about a month and a half to make this video, which is why I've been gone so long. And yeah, hopefully you all enjoy it. And I'll see you all after Christmas. And I also wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Toodles!